In this video I will give you a guide on how to optimize cycles so you will be able to exactly choose where to cut on quality and where to add quality. And that goes through understanding how cycles works. Alright, here in Blender 4.2 the first thing I want to optimize is the viewport. Now, if you go to camera view, there are all these unnecessary pixels getting calculated. So what you can do is press Ctrl B and then just drag a box roughly around the camera, and now it will just render inside the camera and not outside the camera. You can also just render little parts anywhere you like and then press Ctrl Alt B to remove it. You can also go right down here to performance and then to viewport and decrease the pixel size to something really low, or like this, and now it will render really fast because it calculates less pixels. This will only affect the viewport and not the render. Keeping your samples at something like 5 or 10 is probably good in the viewport. Right here in the denoise settings, put the pre-filter to fast and the quality also to fast. Let's now talk about the actual rendering. Now, the first setting right here is samples. These are basically rays bouncing from the camera and seeing where the light is and how illuminated the area is, something like that. So the more samples you have, the more accurate the brightness and color of the pixels are. If you go to 4000 for this simple scene, it's going to throw all of these samples at it for nothing because it's already a very, very good estimate of what it will be. If an area like this only has a little bit of noise, the noise threshold will kick in and stop rendering that area. It will just start rendering only these noisy areas. What you can do is put this up to something like 0.5 for a little bit low quality, or 0.1 for pretty high quality. This will reduce the amount of samples you need because the samples won't be wasted on the white spots, which are already pretty good. I've often used like 256 or 128 samples, but this is fine for still. If you want to render an animation though, you can start at 2 samples, but it will have a lot of noise. So if you render an animation, 5 samples is a good amount that clears up most of the noise, but this won't be very good for scenes with glass or some objects. This is very dependent on what your scene looks like, because if you need to bounce around a lot, this is not gonna be enough. Basically what I'm saying is you want to adjust your render settings based on your scene. So these samples are good for a scene with not a lot of reflections and transparency. But if you have a scene with a lot of that, you can just try it out and you will see that you need more samples. But it's a good idea to start at this low amount of samples so you can try out how much quality you actually need. Now here in denoise, I found that it isn't a very big difference between these pre-filters in quality. I like to set the pre-filter to fast and the quality to balanced, because that doesn't really decrease the quality too much and it still looks pretty good. Also, all of these settings want to be implemented based on your scene. So some settings are more important if you do an animation. Most of these are, because you want to reduce all the time it takes to render a frame. You want to make it really fast. So these denoise settings really make a big difference when you have a long animation. Now here under lights, you want to just uncheck light tree. I don't really know what it does, but you can just keep it unchecked. Now the next thing we are going to go into is light paths. Now these bounces are good for scenes where you have a lot of glass or something. You can basically tell the total bounces, it's fine to go with the default of 6 or something like that. Now diffuse and glossy. This is basically a diffuse surface. A metallic surface is glossy. Transmission is a glass or something like that, which you can see through. Volume is fog, and transparency is also a kind of see-through, but without refraction and stuff. So what you can do is, for this scene right now, I only need to diffuse, so I will just set all of these to 0. And you can just see what happens, so you don't have to worry about it being not good enough or something. Max bounces of 6, you can basically see yourself how important that is, because light is going to bounce off this and then hit this surface right here, so you only really need 2 or 3 bounces to get all of this in this scene, but for other scenes it's very dependent on the scene. Now you can just start at a very low amount, like 2 bounces, and then increase the bounces as you go to see what you actually need to render. Now you do want to check this box called Fast GI Approximation. Now a level of 1 is too low, but you can set it to 2, and that will have a very good impact on your rendering. But if it's still too dark for you, you can also put it up to 3. That's generally how high I would go with this. What this does is it replaces your bounces with an approximation of a bounce. So it's less quality the further in of your bounces are, and 3 bounces is very good for the scene and for mostly everything, and this will stop calculating the bounces before, so it will drastically improve render times. Now right here, if you check the Simplify tab, you can bring down the max subdivisions for any subdivision modifier. You can also limit the textures in the viewport, which is really handy. You can put the texture limit to 512, and now every texture in the viewport will be displayed as very low quality, but in a render it will be the same. Now here in the render you have the same settings, and the texture limit you can also set. If you have some 4K textures but you only need 2K for the entire scene, you can set it to 2K or 1K even. Now here you can check motion blur. If you want to get fancy with it, you can change the shutter curve or something, but the default settings are good. It doesn't add too much to your render time and it looks good. Now here under film you can change this pixel filter width to 1 pixel. This just makes the images a little bit sharper. Right here under performance memory, you can check this box, use tiling, and set this tile size to 512. So now instead of rendering in one big blob, it will render 512 by 512 pixels at a time. And this can reduce the load on your computer and speed up render times through that. It's also more satisfying to watch. Right here, if you have an animation, you can check this box, persistent data. Through this setting, if you render an animation, it will just load in all the textures once, and then instead of loading it in a couple of seconds every time you render a new frame, it will keep that stored in your memory, and then it will shave like 2 seconds or 1 second, dependent on the amount of your textures from every frame of the animation, which can add up to a huge amount. Alright, now that are most of the render settings. Now right here under the format you have these resolution options. And if you change it to 4K in this format, you can just put it to 50% quality and now it will be HD. You can also put it to 200% quality and now it will be 8K. So this is really useful. You can just put it to 30% and it will be a little bit lower than HD. This you can do for your test renders to render them even quicker. Now as for output format, I would suggest almost never using PNG. Always just using JPEG for a final image and setting the quality to 90% or 100%. If it is 100%, the JPEG is like 4 times the size than 90%, but it has almost no artifacts. If you need to have an alpha channel, like a transparent layer, you want to choose PNG and RGB alpha. If you want to have an image with a lot of depth for later color grading, you can choose OpenEXR. Now, if you want an alpha channel, you can select it. You can check 16-bit or 32-bit, and you want to put it to zip if you want it as lossless, or WFAA if you want it as almost perfect, really, really good, almost no pixels changed, but much smaller files than zip. One really important thing is you aren't just able to change a setting and then it's going to be the perfect setting. You have to adjust these render settings according to your scene. So to do that properly, you can set your max samples to a very low amount first, and then go to your rendering tab and now render a test image with these low samples. You can press escape to cancel the rendering. And now you have this image on slot 2. And you can change between slots and test render an image for each slot. And then you will have the time it took to render and the quality it was. So this is very useful for trying out which render settings fit your scene the best. Alright, that was my guide to faster rendering in cycles in the viewport. Thank you for watching, I hope you learned something, and goodbye.